Imagine being a slave one week and a soldier the next, standing on a hilltop with a musket in your hands, while the best trained killers in Europe march straight at you. That is not a movie plot. That actually happened in the winter and summer of 1778, and almost nobody has ever heard the full story. It began in the frozen misery of Valley Forge, where George Washington's army was not fighting the British at all. It was fighting starvation, disease, and the cold, and it was losing badly. Out of that suffering came a decision so radical that it would have been unthinkable just a year earlier, and it would end with formerly enslaved men breaking 3 charges from elite European mercenaries on a single bloody afternoon. Valley Forge was never a battlefield. It was a slow, grinding disaster that killed roughly 2,000 of the 12,000 men who marched into camp that December. They were not dying from bullets. They were dying from typhus, smallpox, frostbite, and hunger. While the ground froze so hard that burial parties could not keep up with the bodies. Soldiers wrapped bleeding feet in rags because there were no shoes left, and men chewed on old leather straps just to trick their stomachs into feeling full. Washington wrote to Congress that nearly 3,000 of his men were unfit for duty, simply because they had no clothes to wear. On top of all that, enlistments were expiring, and nobody could blame the men who chose to walk away from a war that could not even feed them. Rhode Island was in especially rough shape. Its 2 continental regiments had shrunk from a peak of 600 men down to a scattered few hundred, and the state had already run out of willing white volunteers. Meanwhile, the British sat comfortably in Newport, holding one of the most valuable ports in New England, daring anyone to come take it back. That is when General James Varnum, a lawyer-turned-officer from Rhode Island, proposed something nobody in the Continental Army had seriously tried before. He suggested recruiting enslaved men directly into the ranks, promising freedom in exchange for military service. Washington did not approve the idea outright, but he did not shut it down either. He simply passed it along to the governor of Rhode Island and let the state make the call, which said everything about how desperate things had become. The Rhode Island Assembly moved fast, and on February 14th, 1778, they passed the Slave Enlistment Act. The wording was blunt. Any enslaved man who passed inspection would be discharged from his master immediately and declared absolutely free. Slave owners would be paid back from the public treasury, so the freedom was real. But it was also a transaction dressed up as liberty. Plantation owners across the colonies were horrified, warning that these men would be thrown away as cannon fodder and that the promise of freedom was a trap. Despite every warning, men came anyway. Within 4 months, more than 130 recruits signed up, and 88 of them walked straight out of bondage and into a Continental Army uniform, many from the very families that had once owned them. The regiment that formed was unlike anything else in the entire Continental Army. It reached about 225 soldiers, and roughly 140 of them were Black or Native American, making it the only segregated unit of color in Washington's forces. Colonel Christopher Green, a battle-tested officer who had already helped defend Fort Mercer against 2,000 Hessian troops, was sent to lead them. These men, many of whom had never been allowed to touch a weapon in their entire lives, were drilled by the famously harsh Prussian officer, Baron von Steuben, in the same frozen fields where the rest of the army was learning to fight like professionals. By late spring, 60 privates of color and a dozen white officers stood ready under Captain Thomas Arnold, and their first taste of combat came that June at the brutal, sweltering Battle of Monmouth. But the real test was still 2 months away, on a hill overlooking Narragansett Bay. A joint attack with French warships was supposed to crush the British garrison in Newport, but a violent storm scattered both fleets, and the French sailed off to Boston for repairs instead of finishing the fight. American militia watched their allies disappear over the horizon and simply went home, cutting Sullivan's army in half within a single day. The British commander in Newport saw his chance and sent columns marching after the retreating Americans. And one of those columns, made up of feared Hessian mercenaries, was heading straight toward a hill called Turkey Hill. That is exactly where the 1st Rhode Island had been placed, on the flank the British fully expected to collapse first. It did not collapse. The Hessians came up that hill 3 separate times, bayonets fixed, drums pounding, expecting to punch straight through what they assumed would be the weakest line in the entire American army. 3 separate times, the 1st Rhode Island held their ground and drove them back down the slope in disciplined volleys of musket fire. A nearby stream ran so red with blood that locals started calling it Bloody Run Creek. And by the end of the day, the British and Hessian forces had suffered around 260 casualties, more than half of them from the units that had thrown themselves at that one hillside. The 1st Rhode Island lost only a single man killed and 10 wounded. The Marquis de Lafayette himself reportedly called it the best fought action of the entire war. Sadly, the political reward for this courage never matched the sacrifice. The Slave Enlistment Act was repealed after only 4 months, once slave owners lobbied hard enough, and voters even removed the lawmakers who had supported it. No more black or native recruits were allowed to join after that summer, though the men already serving kept their freedom and their place in the ranks. The regiment fought on for years afterward, surviving a horrific ambush that killed their beloved Colonel Greene, and, according to some accounts, saw captured soldiers sold back into slavery in the Caribbean, despite everything they had earned. They marched all the way to Yorktown in 1781 and helped storm the British defenses in a nighttime bayonet charge that helped end the war for good. When the 1st Rhode Island was finally disbanded on Christmas Day in 1783, its men had served longer than almost any other unit in the entire Continental Army, from the very first year of the war to the very last. They went home to a country that owed them back pay it never fully settled, with no land grants and no pensions waiting for them, despite everything they had bled for. For nearly 2 centuries, their story simply vanished from the history books most people were taught. Yet historians have pointed out something remarkable. There is no record of white soldiers ever complaining about serving beside them. The resistance never came from the men fighting in the trenches together. It came from the politicians sitting comfortably far away from Turkey Hill, deciding that a story this powerful was too inconvenient to remember.